Decades of lies, deleted documents, and murmurs in shadowy hallways have buried the truth, which I am aware of. I haven't spoken for years, but last night I got a transmission that made me reveal the truth about what really happened up there and why we never returned. Most people think that after the first few Apollo missions, the public lost interest in traveling to the moon, or that it wasn't worth the cost. I was drinking a glass of bourbon by the fireside when the radio crackled to life. The equipment was ancient and gathering dust, with rusted knobs and wiring intertwined like an old man's thoughts. I had set it up years ago, more as a hobby than anything more. A voice from the past, weak but distinct enough to shiver me to the bone, suddenly broke through the static. This is a rerun of Apollo 18. Apollo 18, I nearly knocked the bottle off the table when I bolted upright. Frank Miller was my dearest friend, my brother in blood and spirit, and the man who never came back from the mission. His name hit me like a kick to the belly. The person buried far away in a location without a grave marker was never discussed by us. The voice came again, more urgent, more belligerent. LED Harris, do you copy this as Miller? My hand shook as I changed the frequency, praying that I hadn't gone crazy or that my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. Even though I was present when they sent him up and when they told us all to forget it ever happened by ending the mission, I never forgot. My mind has been plagued by the ghost of Frank Miller for nearly half a century. Everything started to resurface, including the sensitive documents, the whispered threats, the unanswered late-night phone calls, and now this voice. It sounds as though it is emanating from the ocean floor. It was completely nonsensical. After Apollo 17, the public was informed that we were done with moon missions, and Apollo 18 was formally canceled in 1970. But there was one more to come. Back when I worked as a communications engineer, all I could receive out of the radio was more static with occasional bursts of that familiar but unsettling crackling. A faint mechanical hum, or perhaps a heartbeat, might be heard in the background. We were informed that Apollo 18, one of the handful approved for special projects, was only another ploy to raise money. The night before launch, though, Frank called me after he was selected, and I recall everything he said. They're not telling us everything, John. There's something out there that they don't want us to see. If I don't make it back, promise me you'll find out why. He then vanished, and everything was classified as he died on the pad from a fuel leak. Every door was thrown shut in my face as I attempted to dig. I made an effort to ask around, but the more I did, the more I understood that individuals were either too proud or too afraid to speak up, to drink away the nightmares until tonight. When Frank's voice dragged me back from the grave I had created for myself, I finally gave up, retired early, and moved out here to the mountains. They closed the base, moved all of us to other projects, and acted as if the terrible event had never occurred. Shiver up my spine like someone was observing me from my own cabin's shadows. All I could hear was the steady crackling of the radio and the slight rustle of the wind outside when I looked around, half expecting to see a man in a black suit with a thin smile. With my heart pounding, I drew closer to the receiver, and the response came more quickly than I had expected. A deep, guttural chuckle that sounded like the laughing of someone who knows a secret, followed by a low, distorted growl that sounded like metal scraping on metal. My blood froze. Many years ago, when I was still working for NASA and there were still flights up there, I had heard the sound previously, although on a different frequency. They're here, God willing. This is Apollo 18. The silence that followed seemed thick and heavy, like if the air itself were pushing down on me. I knew I needed to access my files to the hidden cache I had stored in a metal box under the floorboards because I could hear my own breath, unsteady and strained. I scampered to the floor and used my bare hands to pry up the loose board as soon as I realized the end was in sight. I felt as though my heart could burst from the intense hammering. With trembling fingers, I took out the box and opened it to find the files inside, undamaged but yellowed and water-stained. Desperate to find something to explain what I had just heard, I scanned through them, and at the bottom was a blurry black and white picture of Frank on a surface in his suit. When I saw something else beside him, the hair on the back of my neck sprang up. The shape indicated familiarity, yet it was a skeletal figure in decay, not human. A shadow that shouldn't have been there was visible in the backdrop, right past the lunar module. I understood why we never went back to the moon. Something was still waiting there, and I knew that whatever had happened to Frank and his crew wasn't an accident. The covert facility was buried in 1976 because the desert heat was unpleasant, even at night. They wanted someone they could trust who wouldn't bother them with too many questions, which is why I was there. But trust only lasts so long. I knew this operation was unique the moment I entered the control room because they had brought in a scientist I had never heard of. We dubbed it the bunker, but it was more than that. Down in the Nevada sands, out of sight. It was a subterranean maze of laboratories, communication hubs, and control rooms constructed specifically for Apollo 18. It was the final place on Earth, yet it didn't exist officially. The mission commander, Colonel Richard Hayes, came next. He was a quiet man, the kind of man who could look you in the eye and say nothing. Although no one knew him well, he was respected by all. He had the appearance of someone who had too many secrets and too many sights to see. I certainly didn't trust him, and he didn't either. Of Dr. Evelyn Green, towering, eagle-eyed, and constantly holding a notepad as if it contained the universe's secrets. Didn't believe him. And then there was my old friend Frank Miller, who I could always count on. Despite the dangers, he was unfazed because he had traveled to the moon previously. I could see the anxiety in his eyes as he joked that another day would bring another $1. Like me, he sensed that something wasn't quite right with this expedition, and we were informed that it was only to examine some strange signals that a satellite close to the moon's dark side had detected, perhaps in order to collect some samples. But I could tell they were keeping us in the dark as soon as I got in. As Harris Hayes would say, the briefings were brief, the papers were redacted, and if I asked questions, I got evasive answers or blank stares. Not just the secrecy, though, but the way Green and Hayes talked in low voices and kept looking over their shoulders as though they felt someone or something was listening also gave me the creeps. When I tried to talk to Frank about it, he just shrugged and said, "They're spooked, but we're used to it." Without any delays or problems, the launch proceeded more smoothly than expected, and they disappeared into the darkness. Before they entered lunar orbit, the comms were as obvious as day, but then things started to go awry. Minor signal fluctuations and malfunctions were the only things I heard at first, but then weird sounds started to emerge through the transmission, such as Frank's voice crackling through my headset, sounding feeble and jumbled like whispers in a language I had never heard before. I turned the settings in an attempt to remove the interference, but the whispers continued. According to Hay, it only grew louder and more persistent like a broken record stuck on a foreign chant. He stated, "It must be solar interference," but I could tell he was unsure. Green's hands were clutching that fucking notebook tighter than ever, and her face was white. A quick peek over her shoulder at her notes revealed something that shivered me. A rough but undeniable drawing of a figure, a form, or something that didn't appear human. Frank's voice was stronger and more urgent the next day. "Harris, can you verify that it's in the surface shadows?" My heart was pounding as I watched the satellite feeds, and sure enough, there was a little but moving shadow scuttling across the lunar surface when there shouldn't be any movement at all. My brow started to perspire coldly, but I lied, and Frank didn't believe me. "We saw it, John." Miller and Stern kept on course, and they proceeded to the coordinates, but the stress was rising as even seemingly insignificant details like the oxygen meters flickered. She looked up with a mask of horror on her face and murmured, "We're not alone." Her voice trembled, the kind of fear that only comes from knowing something awful, and I could hear it, or the freezing of the navigation systems. Harris heard Frank's voice get more strained and tense. "Something is watching us out here, I swear to God." Hayes turned off the gearbox. Green's eyes were wide as she scrawled frantically in her notebook, whispering something I couldn't understand. I leaned in. "That's enough, Green. We're here to retrieve, not theorize." Frank's voice broke the tension again, this time in a low, nearly whispery manner, and Hayes slapped his hand on the table. The comms fell silent. "Harris, there's a structure here, it's not natural, and there's something inside I think it's waiting for us." I tried every frequency and channel, but all I got was static. I thought I had lost him for a few painful moments, but then Frank's voice came back, frantic. "It's alive, it's..." They told us lies because they knew something was present. Green's notebook was open to a page full of odd symbols that seemed to imply something, and I looked at her. Her face was as pale as death. "If you can't hear me," Frank's voice was breaking, full with a panic I had never heard from him before, and I could feel my hands shaking and my breath speeding as Hayes shouted commands. I realized that things were far from under control, even though Hayes was on the radio attempting to soothe Frank and try to get things under control. On the screens, shadows were shifting in odd patterns and were darker than the moon night. I couldn't get rid of the impression that the cold was seeping in from deep within, not from the room. Then, just before the transmission terminated, I heard that deep mechanical laughter again, faintly but definitely. It's massive, John, bigger than anything we expected, half buried like it's been here for centuries or longer, Frank said in a tense, strained voice. His sentences were fast and clipped, as if he could feel something non-stone pressing against his chest, and he sounded as though he was having trouble breathing. Harris, God help us, it's too late. It was almost inhuman, and I realized something was very wrong. Then there was stillness, the type of silence that buries secrets deeper than the darkest lunar craters. Its surface glowed dimly in the sunshine, as though it were composed of a substance that sucked in and absorbed light, giving it an antique, yet living appearance. Grainy pictures of a building sticking out of the moon's surface were captured by the surface cameras. It had two smooth edges and curved in ways that were difficult to see, as though it was intended to be hidden. Green verified the readings, saying, "This isn't a sightseeing tour. This structure is emitting signals, the same signals." Frank's breathing was audible, labored. "You're telling me we're not the first to find this place," she said, her voice hardly more than a whisper, pausing before continuing. "It matches the signatures, the ones we picked up in 1969. Green didn't answer, a look of recognition or perhaps fear flickering across her face. As Miller walked to the door, Hayes snubbed the inquiry and yelled commands. "I don't like this at all," Frank said, half to himself and half to me, as he advanced, his steps slow and deliberate on the lunar dust. He continued, edged toward the dark mouth of the structure, a gaping hole that appeared to suck the light from all around it. Dust motes hung in the air like little stars disturbed by the team's movement, and the interior was almost completely dark, only illuminated by the beams of their helmet lights. Green collects samples, therefore before extracting anything from it, we must safeguard it. In the center of the chamber, they found a person with its limbs twisted at odd angles, collapsed on the floor, and partially buried in the dust. It looked almost human at first, but as Frank got closer, the details became apparent. Its head was elongated, its eyes were buried deep into hollow sockets, its mouth was slightly open as if frozen in a silent scream, and its skin, what was remained of it, was thin and almost translucent, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. Green's voice trailed off as she gasped and dropped her notebook. Her voice had a faint tremble, and she was breathing over the calories. "What the hell is this, Green? You know something, don't you recognize this thing?" Frank said, turning back his voice. She didn't answer immediately, instead fixing her gaze on the figure with a mix of terror and another emotion that I couldn't quite identify. Her voice was almost a whisper, and she swallowed hard because we've found signs of this form in the Apollo 11 samples. Without hesitation, Hayes bagged it, and we're taking it back. With a low growl, Frank remained firm, saying, "I don't like this, Colonel. This thing doesn't belong here. We should leave it." Hayes interrupted him abruptly, saying, "That's an order, Miller. We're here to retrieve, not to question." Green approached the figure, holding a containment bag, her hands shaking, and she muttered to herself more than anyone else, "We don't have much time." Hayes stepped forward, his tone brooking, "No argument. You're here to obey orders." Why in the world was Frank's voice so tense with fear? After a moment of hesitation, Green leaned down and touched the creature's skin with her fingers. A deep rumble vibrated through the building, and the earth seemed to tremble when she touched it. With haste, Green encased the figure in the containment bag and tightened the closure. She said, "We have it," but her tone sounded halting, as though she wasn't entirely sure she was telling the truth. Everything briefly went dark as the lights flickered. During this dreadful time, all I could hear was their faint, fast breathing, followed by a voice that wasn't Hayes's, Green's, or Frank's. That voice sounded as though it were coming from deep within the moon itself, cold, heartless, and mechanical. The shadows around them began to move like liquid in the darkness as the calories crackled with static, and I heard Frank murmur something along the lines of, What is that? Hayes was shouting now, trying to get control. Miller, report Green. What the hell is going on? We must depart immediately, but it was too late. The shadows had already descended upon them, closing in SH shapes and moving in ways that were incomprehensible to the laws of physics and logic. The shadows were being moved by the low light that was creeping closer, and Frank's voice sounded agitated. One by one, the module systems began to malfunction. I watched in terror as the telemetry panels screamed warnings, red lights flashed everywhere, communications broke, oxygen levels dropped, and power surged. Over the commotion, Green's voice could hardly be heard. Frank was panting and his voice was full of fear as he said, "They're right behind us." The shadows reached out, tendrils of darkness stretching across the surface, creeping up the module's landing struts. The engines of the module roared to life, sputtering, struggling. "We're losing power," Green said in a high-pitched voice. "We're not going to make it." The voice reappeared, colder than before, as though it had come from the very depths of space. Then, suddenly, the stream stopped working. The displays blinked off, the screens went dark, and I was left alone in the control room as Frank's last words pierced the turbulence, and they cried out, "Get us out of here, John. They're coming." The last devastating transmission that was still reverberating in my mind was all that was left, along with the sound of my own ragged breathing. "You shouldn't have come." They brought them back in the dead of night. No fanfare, press, or parade. Just a cold clinical arrival under the Coverup. The surviving astronauts, if you could call them that, were shadows of their former selves. Frank was hunched over, eyes darting around, his skin pale and waxy as if he'd aged a decade in the few days since I'd last heard his voice. Dr. Green was different, too. Not scared exactly, but hollow, her eyes wide and empty, her movements stiff and almost robotic, as if she were trapped in a loop replaying the same nightmare over and over again. Their movements were precise, almost military, and their faces were hard and unreadable. I had never seen them before, and they wore no insignias, but there was something about the way they looked at me cold clinically, like they were measuring me up for a coffin. Frank, on the other hand, was held in a holding room at the edge of the facility, a small windowless cell with one-way glass. They claimed it was for debriefing, but I knew better. They moved me Green through the hangar and into a black van without plates, and I never saw her again. He looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands were shaking, and his voice was a cracked whisper. "John, they're watching. They're always watching what happened up there," I said, keeping my voice low, peering over my shoulder. "What did you see?" "We weren't alone, John. There's something out there that they don't want us to know about." He moved forward, his words almost audible above a whisper, and shook his head, his eyes wide, pupils dilated like a caged animal. "That's enough, Miller." The door flew open, and two men grabbed Frank by the shoulders and dragged him away before he could say anything more. Knowing John, they knew something was waiting up there, and now they're trying to bury it all, and us with it. One of them snapped, "You've said too much," and Frank struggled, shouting over his shoulder, "John, find Green, find out what she knew." They left, leaving me standing there with my mind and heart racing. And the next day, I was called into a briefing, and they handed me a thick file. A note was slipped under my door in neat mechanical handwriting, and I couldn't let it go unless I remained silent, or else they knew it wasn't over. They knew it wasn't over because I didn't have time to process it before the threat started. A phone call in the middle of the night with no voice on the other end, just breathing, and the feeling of being watched constantly. Inside were photos of the alien figure they'd found on the moon, blurry, dark, but unmistakable, sealed with a red top secret stand stamp. I kept my head down at work and pretended that I had let it go, but I never stopped looking. One night, a tall, thin man with a nervous twitch in his eye showed up at my door and introduced himself as Paul Harper. He said he had been following the trail, and the more I dug, the more I found small pieces that didn't fit together, strange sightings, and whispers of things moving in the dark where nothing should move. He told me, "You don't know the half of the Apollo 18 story for years," in a voice that was a mix of excitement and fear. The mission was only the beginning. He showed me a folder full of documents, including strange disappearances of astronauts, pilots, and even civilians, as well as UFO sightings, all of which were connected to the same pattern and signals. He also showed me maps with red circles drawn around incomprehensible locations and grainy photos of flying objects that were identified by Uniden. There are other Johns, others who didn't return, and others who saw things they weren't supposed to see. I didn't want to believe him, but I had to admit that there was a ring of truth to his words. Everything I'd seen, heard, and seen started to fit together in a way I could not have imagined. I felt a chill go down my spine as he looked around, his eyes darting anxiously because I've been tracking them, following the people they tried to silence the stories about, and I found something important. The tape stopped abruptly, leaving me to wonder, why are you showing me this? I didn't like that he gave me a tape recorder. It's a recording of a pilot who saw something on the moon before Apollo 18 and disappeared a week later. The voice, filled with fear, crackled through the static. There's something up here. It's not human. It's watching us. We never should have come. John Harper said, "They'll do whatever it takes to keep you quiet," in response to my question, because they're watching you. They've done it before, and they'll do it again, so you need to be very careful. My phone rang during off-peak hours, and when I answered, there was nothing but silence. I opened and resealed my mail, and I saw men in dark cars parked outside my house, their faces obscured by tinted windows. He left as swiftly as he had come, leaving me standing there with the tape recorder in my hand, feeling as if the walls were closing in on me. Then one night my brakes failed, and I barely got off the road before the car slammed into a tree, crawling out dazed, my head throbbing, knowing they were getting closer. At night, I saw flashes of light in the sky, shadows moving where no shadows should be, and my heart raced every time I left the house. I tried reaching out to some of my old contacts, but one by one they stopped responding, and I was cut off and isolated. They kept secrets buried deep, and they weren't going to let me go. Not now. Never. They were willing to bury anyone who got too close. I knew I was next, but I also knew I had to keep digging because whatever they were hiding was bigger than I could have ever imagined. I knew my days were numbered the moment I decided to go public, but the truth has a way of gnawing at you, burrowing deep until it's all you can think about. I started going to the moon for more than 50 years, and you've been told the same story, and we stopped going because there was nothing to see. I started a live stream that was connected through several proxy servers so that people in the halls of power would not follow me too soon. The screen flickered to life, and the camera was pointed at me. I leaned forward and spoke clearly, saying, "You've all been lied to." We never went back, though, because we discovered something up there that we weren't supposed to find. I took a deep breath, knowing that every word I said during Apollo 11 was being watched, knowing that we disturbed something that was an ancient civilization dormant beneath the moon's surface. They didn't tell the public or the world, but they knew from the moment Neil Armstrong set foot on the lunar dust. They covered it up, saying it was just interference, but it wasn't, and that's why Apollo 18 was launched. I leaned closer, my face filling the screen, and they told the crew that Apollo 18 was sent to investigate and retrieve something, but they didn't tell them what they were walking into or that they were going to wake something up. As I went on, they heard a signal, a sound, something reaching out from the dark side of the moon, a transmission that wasn't human. I explained the strange signals and the alien structure. I described Frank's fear, his final words, and how he pleaded for help as the darkness closed in around them. And the screen showed images I had saved from the alien figures' classified files, the green handwritten symbols, the odd shapes captured on the moon's surface, and the shadows that moved on their own. Frank and his crew were attacked by something we still don't understand, something that was waiting for us, something that wanted to stay hidden. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself to continue speaking because I knew I was running out of time. Then, as if on cue, I heard a soft rustle outside my window, a shadow moving just beyond the glass, and my heart pounded. I felt pressure building, and I looked straight into the camera and spoke steadily. "You need to understand we are not alone, we never were, and now they know we are not just out there, they're here among us, and they've been watching. They're here, they've always been here, and now they're making their move, so stay alert, stay awake, and don't believe the story you've been told. For me, they came just as they came for the others, but you must know that you must be prepared." All of a sudden, the lights flickered, the screen glitched, the feed crackled with static, the image broke up, and I saw a shadow cross the room behind me. I knew they had found me, but I persisted, raising my voice above the commotion. Then, As suddenly as the transmission stopped, a voice, not mine, crackled through a deep, distorted voice, saying, "We are not alone. We never were." The sound reverberated low and menacing, repeating like a mantra, and then, on the screen, a shadow against the stark pale light moved across the moon's surface, bigger than anything that should have been there, and the feed flickered twice before cutting out the never-ending darkness silence. The screen remained black, but the words hung in the air as a last, terrifying reminder that we are not alone. Hello, agents like these stories. The question that no one wanted to ask. The truth was out now, but it was too late to stop what was coming, too late to hide from the eyes that had been watching us the entire time. Down here on Earth, we were only beginning to realize how serious what we had disturbed was, and nothing had awakened somewhere in the cold vacuum of space. Don't forget to subscribe so you can read the next story.